Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Alsager. I'm the managing editor of the Soy Connection newsletter. And I just want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar to discuss the role. Let's get started with just a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today will be about 45 minutes long. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type those in as we go, but we will reserve the question and answer portion of the program for the end of the webinar. So to ask questions, you're going to want to hover over your control bar in the Zoom window and click on the Q&A icon. And a window will pop up and you can type in your question. A recording of today's webinar will be available after it's over and will be emailed to you. And we'd invite you to chime in on Twitter or Instagram using the hashtag #SoyWebinar. The last thing before we begin, we'd like for each of you to answer just a couple of questions. So we're going to have a poll pop up on your screen here in just a moment. And if you could click on an answer to each of those questions, we would appreciate it. Okay, so those questions are on your screen now. Question number 1, do you view soy and soy foods as a healthy nutritional choice? Yes, no, don't know. And question number 2, how likely are you to recommend soy foods to your patients, clients, or others you advise? You could answer those questions now. We'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, about 5 more seconds. Okay, thank you very much for weighing in on that poll. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to today's speakers, Mark and Virginia Messina. Virginia Messina is a registered dietitian who writes and speaks on plant-based nutrition for health professionals and the public. She has written books on vegan nutrition for consumers and co-authored the first vegetarian textbook for health professionals, The Dietitian's Guide to Vegetarian Diets. Her website is theveganrd.com, and she is at theveganrd on Twitter. Dr. Mark Messina is the co-owner of Nutrition Matters Incorporated, a nutrition consulting company, and is an adjunct professor at Loma Linda University. His research focuses on the health effects of soy foods and soybean components. He's also the chairman of the Soy Connection editorial board and executive director of the Soy Nutrition Institute. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mark and Jenny.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so great to be here, and we'll be talking today about soy foods and plant-based diets and the issues that impact the role that these foods can play. This slide summarizes our perspective, which is that vegetarians can be happy and healthy without including soy foods in their diets, but there are practical benefits to including these foods, and they also may enhance the health of people eating plant-based diets. We say this because many of these foods are convenient ways to meet nutrient needs, and they have unique attributes that favorably impact health. So let's start by looking at how much soy vegetarians actually eat. And we can look at the Adventist Health Study too for some information about this. The Adventist Health Study is the only large prospective study in North America to include significant numbers of vegetarians and vegans, and it's given us a great deal of information about the health and diets of these groups. 40% of the subjects enrolled in this study follow some type of vegetarian diet. The study found that as the diet becomes increasingly plant-based, soy protein intake goes up. So for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, soy protein accounted for about 14% of total protein intake, and among vegans, it's about 18%. Because the subjects enrolled in the Adventist Health Study tend to engage in healthy habits compared to the rest of the population, it's not surprising to see that even the meat eaters among this group derive a little more than 6% of their protein from soy. Now, we can get some perspective on this by comparing it to how dairy contributes to protein intake among average Americans. So again, these are the contributions that soy protein makes to plant-based diets among Adventists. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians, vegans get between 14 and 18% of their protein as soy. This is pretty comparable to the contribution that dairy foods make to protein intake of the average American. This is NHANES data, and it shows that the average person gets 16% of their total protein from dairy. So we can conclude that soy is an important source of protein, but it's by no means the dominant source, even in vegan diets. Now, we dietitians hear many questions about meeting protein needs on plant-based diets. The research does show fairly consistently that plant-based diets of different types contain plenty of protein. And again, we can look at the Adventist Health Study for information about this. You can see that the average intake of protein for vegans was 72 grams, which well exceeds the RDA of 56 grams for a 70 kilogram person. And interestingly, protein intake is similar across all of the dietary groups. It's important to keep in mind, though, that protein requirements may be slightly higher for some groups, particularly vegans, due to the lower digestibility of proteins from whole grains and legumes in comparison to protein from animal foods. Estimates are that vegans require about 10% more protein than non-vegetarians. But even with these elevated needs, it appears that vegans are getting enough total protein. If we look again at intakes from the Adventist Health Study, but compare them this time with a recommendation of 62 grams, which represents a 10% increase in the protein RDA for a 70 kilogram person, it's clear that vegetarians and vegans still exceed requirements. But even when total protein intake is adequate, it's possible for plant-based diets to fall short of the essential amino acid lysine. The best plant sources of this amino acid are legumes, a group of food that includes dried beans, all types of soy foods, peanuts, and peanut butter. It's really important for vegans in particular to make sure that they're including at least 2 servings per day of foods from this group, and 3 servings can actually give a little bit of extra insurance. Over-reliance on grains can end up displacing legumes, which can cause diets to become too low in lysine, since grains are much lower in this amino acid.
This discussion of lysine provides a nice segue into a discussion of the quality of soy protein. As I'm sure most of you recognize, protein quality is determined by 2 factors, digestibility and amino acid content. But of the 2, amino acid content is much more important because most proteins are fairly well digested. And this is the case for soy protein. As you can see, the digestibility of isolated soy protein and soy protein concentrate, 2 soy ingredients I'll be discussing in just a moment, easily exceeds 95%. As I just noted, amino acid content is a much bigger determinant of protein quality than digestibility. So let's look at the composition of soy protein in relation to the requirements for the essential amino acids. Here we have the requirements recently established by the FAO for 2 age groups, 6 months to 3 years of age and over the age of 3 years. We can see that the lysine content of soy protein easily exceeds the lysine requirements for both age groups, but that's not surprising because it's grains that are low in lysine, not beans. Beans tend to be very high in lysine. In contrast, beans are low in the sulfur amino acids, methionine, and cysteine, represented here by SAA. But even in the case of the sulfur amino acids, the amount in soy matches the FAO requirements. So given that soy is well digested and has an excellent amino acid profile, it's not surprising that the PD-CAS, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score for soy protein, is 1.0, the highest score using this methodology. That's the same score that milk receives and egg white. The score for soy is actually a little bit higher than for beef protein, and it's much higher than the scores for all the other plant proteins showed on this slide. Now, in addition to being very high quality, soy protein is efficiently produced, and that's an important consideration because environmental impact is increasingly becoming a factor in food purchases. A paper published in 2011, which evaluated many different protein sources, found out of all the sources evaluated, soy protein was most efficiently produced in regard to the resources required for its production. Now, I'm sure you recognize that the protein recommendations for endurance and strength athletes far exceed the RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. So the recommendations range from 50% higher to more than twice as high. That's still not going to be a problem for plant-based athletes to get enough protein, because when you're engaged in exercise, you're consuming more calories, and as long as those additional calories include some protein sources, you're going to meet protein requirements. But if in fact one finds it difficult to meet protein requirements as an athlete via whole foods, then supplementation is another option. And I would have to say there's probably no better way to supplement the diet than to use soy protein ingredients. These are soy protein products that range in protein content from 50 to 90%. So you have soy flour, soy concentrate, and soy isolate. Basically, you take the soybean, get rid of the fat, fiber, and carbohydrate to varying degrees. These soy protein ingredients are widely used by the food industry. They're found in literally hundreds and hundreds of commonly consumed foods, in part because they are so widely used for functional purposes. So you even find these ingredients in soy in products like Wonder Bread, although that's not the ideal way to add soy to your diet. But these products are typically used in very small amounts when they're used for functional purposes. And so they don't really make a significant contribution to protein intake. They're used because they can enhance moisture retention, increase shelf life, and change texture in a variety of different ways. More importantly, these products are used as a base for making dairy and meat analogs and for boosting the protein content of foods such as breakfast cereals and energy or breakfast bars. Now, importantly, a recently published meta-analysis found that soy protein supplementation leads to similar gains in muscle mass and strength in response to resistance exercise training as whey and animal protein supplementation. This meta-analysis included 4 studies that directly compared soy with whey and 5 studies that compared soy with other animal proteins such as beef and milk. These studies were 6 to 16 weeks in duration. Now, one issue that is relevant to both vegetarians and non-vegetarians, plant-based consumers and non-plant-based consumers, is not the total amount of protein consumed, but the protein distribution intake pattern. And most of the evidence suggests that our pattern is suboptimal. And that's because experts recommend that we consume protein evenly throughout the day. In fact, it's recommended that we consume about 25 to 30 grams of high quality protein at each of the 3 major meals. But you can see here from Haynes data published 2005-2006 involving men and women at least 51 years of age, that we get about 56% of our protein at the dinner hour, and afterwards only about 20% of our protein comes at breakfast. So that's a suboptimal approach to protein intake. Some good soy-based choices for increasing protein at the breakfast meal include tofu scramble, tofu soy sausages. You can make a smoothie fortified with soy protein, or use soy milk in soy yogurt in a variety of ways. And it's important to point out that soy milk is the only plant-based milk that contains the same amount of protein as cow's milk. All the other plant-based milks, unless they are fortified, are very low in protein.
Soybeans are unique among legumes because of their macronutrient content. For example, they're about 40% fat, while other beans are around 3% fat, or really almost virtually fat-free. The fat in soybeans, however, is primarily low in saturated fat and provides mostly heart-healthy monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. One of the unique things about the fat in soybeans and soy foods is that it's a relatively good source of the essential omega-3 fat, alpha-linolenic acid. And this is really important because it's important in plant-based diets, because only a handful of plant foods provide meaningful amounts of these fats. Compared to ALA sources like flax and hemp seeds, soybeans are relatively low in omega-3s. For example, 100 grams of flaxseed provides about 23 grams of alpha-linolenic acid, while a comparable amount of soybeans has a bit less than 1.5 grams. But even so, certain soy foods can make a meaningful contribution to ALA intake. For example, 100 grams of tofu, which is about 3.5 ounces, provides well over half of the ALA RDA for an adult woman and about 40% of what an adult male needs. In addition to total ALA content, there's been considerable interest in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats in foods. You can see that soybeans have a fairly high ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s compared to other sources of these fatty acids, especially flax and chia seeds. And the question about this is whether a higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 causes inflammation. That's been a long-standing belief, but it's fallen out of favor. A 2012 systematic review of RCTs, it included 8 parallel and 7 crossover studies, found no evidence that linoleic acid, the omega-6 fat, increases markers of inflammation. These findings are in agreement with the opinions of experts in the field like Dr. William Harris, who suggests that it's time to move beyond the ratio. The American Heart Association recommends focusing on total intakes of the 2 essential fatty acids rather than on the ratios. And the UK Food Standards Agency Working Group concurs with this. So the current understanding is that linoleic acid does not increase inflammation, and that it's more important to ensure that consumers are getting adequate amounts of the 2 essential fatty acids rather than to focus on their ratio in the diet. While dietary fat continues to be a hot topic in nutrition, there is growing interest in low-carb diets, and this certainly has not escaped the notice of people eating plant-based diets. There are many books, websites, Facebook groups that are dedicated to low-carb and even ketogenic diets for both vegetarians and vegans. An issue with this, for vegans in particular, is that these diets eliminate most legumes, and these are the most important source of protein in vegan menus. But we've already established that soybeans have a unique macronutrient profile. While most soybeans are 70% carbohydrate, while most beans are 70% carbohydrates, soybeans derive only around 27% of calories from carbs. And in addition, most of the carbohydrates in soybeans and soy foods are in the form of oligosaccharides, which are poorly digested, and therefore they may act as prebiotics and have some health benefits. Now, their high oligosaccharide content means that whole soybeans themselves are off the menu for people who are eating a low FODMAP diet. And most of you are probably familiar with this approach to managing IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, by eliminating fermentable short-chain carbohydrates, which includes these oligosaccharides in soybeans. However, because of the way they're processed, many soy foods like tofu and tempeh can be included in low FODMAP diets. So again, this makes them a useful option for vegetarians and vegans who are following these diets.
Now let's take a look at the contribution that soy foods can make to mineral status. The three minerals of particular interest are calcium, zinc, and iron. And that's because if you're not consuming dairy, you're not consuming the #1 source of calcium in the US diet, and meat is a good source of both iron and zinc. The issue on plant-based diets isn't so much the intake of minerals, but the bioavailability of minerals. And that's because it's well recognized that the iron content of plant-based diets typically equals or exceeds the iron content of non-vegetarian diets. However, there are many factors in plant-based diets and in plant foods that inhibit the absorption of minerals. These include protein, phytate, fiber, oxalate, and polyphenols. The one I want to discuss first is phytate. You're all familiar with phytate. This is a naturally occurring compound found in whole grains and beans. It inhibits the absorption of divalent cations, minerals such as calcium, iron, zinc, and magnesium. Now, interestingly, in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority actually bases their zinc intake recommendations on the amount of phytate in the diet. You can see here that if you're consuming a high phytate diet, 1,200 milligrams per day, the zinc intake recommendation is 70% higher than it is for a person consuming a low phytate diet. If you're consuming a plant-based diet based on whole foods, you're going to be consuming a high phytate diet. Now in the US, the zinc recommendations aren't influenced by the phytate content of the diet, but the iron RDA for vegetarians is 80% higher than for people who eat meat because of the assumed lower bioavailability of iron from plant-based diets. Of course, you all recognize that animal foods contain heme iron, which is very well absorbed. Plant foods contain non-heme iron, which the traditional view is that they are this type of iron is very poorly absorbed. Of course, if you consume vitamin C with the iron-containing food, you're going to boost the absorption somewhat. As you can see here, this older work, 1984, involving 10 young men, found the absorption of iron from beans, including soybeans, was really only about 1% versus about 16% for ferrous sulfate, which is typically used as a reference iron source. So the absorption was only about 1/16 that of ferrous sulfate. However, there's somewhat of a new perspective about how well iron might be absorbed from soybeans and perhaps other beans as well. And that's because some of the iron in soybeans is present as ferritin. This is a molecule which may be resistant to inhibitors of iron absorption. And there's some clinical evidence to support this statement. In 2003, research showed, or the authors of research concluded that soybeans appear to be a good source of nutritional iron. You can see on the left part of the screen that the reference dose was absorbed at 60% level. Soybean iron was about 27%. So there was about a 1/3 as well as the reference dose. Even more impressive is the 2006 study. The authors concluded iron from soybean ferritin is very well absorbed. You can see the absorption of iron from the reference dose, ferrous sulfate, and soybean ferritin was essentially the same. However, it may be too early to draw any definitive conclusions about the importance of ferritin iron in soybeans and other beans as well, but I do want to point out two additional clinical trials that I think have considerable bearing onto our discussion here. One was published in 2015 and in my view hasn't received the attention it deserves. This was a multi-week trial that found habitual consumption of a high phytate diet can reduce the negative effect of phytate on non-heme iron absorption. Most bioavailability studies are acute studies, single meal studies. However, this was a multi-week trial that found over time, if you're consuming a high phytate diet, the effect of phytate on iron absorption is greatly minimized. And it's possible that's also true for the effect of phytate on other minerals as well, such as zinc. Well, what about zinc? Soy foods and soybeans are not an especially great source of zinc, although the absorption isn't that bad. Results vary, but zinc from soy is absorbed about 25% less well than from animal foods. A more interesting story has to do with the absorption of calcium from soy foods. I've already mentioned that soy is actually quite high in phytate relative to other beans, but all beans and whole grains are high in phytate. Phytate inhibits the absorption of calcium. Another plant compound that inhibits the absorption of calcium is oxalate. And you can see that some foods that are very high in calcium are not actually good sources of this mineral because bioavailability is so low. And that's especially true for the case of spinach, which is loaded with calcium, but only about 5% of the calcium in spinach is absorbed by the body, so it's not considered a source of this mineral. Now, what's so interesting is despite the fact that soybeans and soy foods are very high in both phytate and oxalate, calcium from calcium fortified soy milk and calcium set tofu is absorbed similarly to calcium from cow's milk. So let's take a quick look at the data. Here's work from 2002 from Connie Weaver's group at Purdue University, looking at the absorption of calcium from cow's milk and tofu among Caucasian and Asian women. The methodologies used to assess calcium intake differed a little bit between the Caucasian and Asian women, but you can see without question that the absorption of calcium set tofu, that's tofu that is made by using a calcium salt to coagulate soy milk, is essentially identical to the absorption of calcium from cow's milk. In the case of soy milk, there's a little bit of a twist to the story, and here we have, again, work from Connie Weaver's group at Purdue, looking at the absorption of calcium from soy milk in comparison to cow's milk among 20 young US women. When tricalcium phosphate is used as the calcium fortificant, the absorption of calcium is identical to the absorption of calcium from cow's milk. In the case of soy milk that use calcium carbonate as the fortificant, the absorption is a little bit less, but it's still quite good. Most soy milks on the market use tricalcium phosphate to fortify their product with calcium, and some use a combination of tricalcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. Now, as it was noted at the onset, soy foods have some unique attributes that may favorably affect the health of plant-based consumers. So we've already talked about the fact that soy foods provide high quality protein. Some are a source of alpha-linolenic acid. Many are low in carbohydrate. I don't have time to discuss in depth the fact that soy protein modestly lowers cholesterol levels, but recently published meta-analysis suggests the reduction in LDL is about 3 to 4%. What I want to focus on is that soy foods are a uniquely rich source of isoflavones. And that point is illustrated by this slide, where you can see the average intake among older Japanese is about 40 milligrams per day, whereas in the US and also in Europe, average intake is less than 3 milligrams per day. One serving of a traditional soy food provides about 25 milligrams of isoflavones. Now, due to time constraints, I would just try to summarize my perspective on the strength of the evidence in support of the proposed benefits of isoflavones. For hot flashes, they're pretty solid data that isoflavones are efficacious. For endothelial function, suggestive data, but the evidence is rather mixed. For cognitive function, the clinical studies are actually supportive of benefit, the observational studies less so. For bone mineral density, many short-term trials, that's less than a year in duration, show some really pronounced benefit, that's inhibiting bone resorption, stimulating bone formation, but the few long-term clinical trials that have been published have been much less supportive. Very speculative evidence that isoflavones alleviate depression. The proposed benefit that I really want to focus on is the hypothesis that's been around for 20 years that consuming soy foods, because they contain isoflavones early in life, that's during childhood and or adolescence, dramatically reduces breast cancer risk later on in life. The observational studies that have examined this hypothesis suggest that one serving per day is associated anywhere from a 25 to 50% reduction in risk. So I recommend that all young girls consume at least 1 serving of soy per day. There's also animal data in support of this hypothesis, but this hypothesis has not yet been examined clinically. There's some suggestive evidence that isoflavones and soy improve the survival of breast cancer patients. I'm going to talk about that again in just a moment. The observational data show post-diagnosis soy intake is very beneficial. The clinical studies are supportive of safety but not benefit. The evidence for prostate cancer prevention is very mixed. I think the evidence was better 10 years ago than it is today. And finally, there's some really suggestive evidence. I'm very excited about this one proposed benefit that isoflavones reduce wrinkles, and the Soy Nutrition Institute is about to fund a study that hopefully will more definitively be able to answer this or address this issue. So let's now finish up with some, very quickly, with some issues facing soy. You all know that one of the misunderstandings about that there's no scientific support for this misunderstanding. I was involved with the meta-analysis published in 2010 involving 30-some studies that found either soy foods or isoflavone supplements alter measures of testosterone concentration. And in many of these clinical studies, the isoflavones that the individuals consumed far exceeded typical Japanese intake. We're in the process of updating this meta-analysis, not only looking at testosterone, but also estrogen levels. Older men make more estrogen than older women. I can tell you there's no effects. Now there are about 50 studies on reproductive hormone levels in men. There's also, the clinical studies also show no effects of isoflavones on sperm or semen parameters. Again, we've talked a little bit about breast cancer. I do want to highlight, because I think it's very important, that independent health organizations have concluded that soy foods are safe for breast cancer patients. These organizations include the American Institute for Cancer Research, American Cancer Society, Canadian Cancer Society, the German Commission on Food Safety, the World Cancer Research Fund International, and the European Food Safety Authority. Thyroid function is another issue that comes up periodically. The evidence clearly indicates there's no effects of soy or isoflavones on the major thyroid hormones. This was the conclusion of a 2006 narrative review that evaluated 14 trials. It's the conclusion of the European Food Safety Authority in their opinion published in 2015. It's also the opinion of the German Commission on Food Safety published in 2018. And the first of its kind meta-analysis to look at the effect of soy on thyroid hormone levels also reached that conclusion. And the safety of soy is also supported by recent statement from the Food and Drug Administration. They stated in 2017, the evidence does not change our previous conclusion that the use of soy protein at the levels necessary to justify a health claim has been demonstrated to our satisfaction to be safe and lawful. The levels that they were referring to here are 25 grams of soy protein per day. That's quite a bit of protein. This review focused on the effects of soy protein. They were looking at cholesterol reduction, but essentially all of the public comments that address safety during the public comment period address concerns related to isoflavones. They were all rejected. And then finally, I just want to mention food allergies. As I'm sure all of you recognize, soy is one of the big 8, the 8 foods that are thought to be responsible for 90% of the food allergic reactions in this country. However, the prevalence of soy allergy is by far and away lowest among the big 8. About 3 out of every 1,000 adults are allergic to soy protein, so it's relatively infrequent. Most children outgrow their soy allergy. Estimated that about 70% outgrow their allergy by age 10, and highly refined soybean oil is not allergenic, and that's because during the processing, essentially all of the protein is removed. And you can read more about these topics in a paper published just very recently in Nutrition Today. It's open access, so anybody can freely download it. And then finally, in terms of intake recommendations, I would say for healthy adults, 2 servings per day is a good goal. For breast cancer survivors, I would limit it to no more than 3 servings per day, although the largest study to examine this issue found that 4 servings per day were still protective against recurrence and improved survival. And for children, I think 1 to 2 servings is appropriate. regardless of how healthy any particular food is, you don't want to put too much emphasis on any single food. That's about it. So thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark and Jenny. And if I can just have you stop sharing your screen, then I'll bring my slides back up. Okay, so we are now going to move into our question and answer portion of the webinar. I just want to once again thank Mark and Jenny for sharing this insight and your expertise in the area. They covered a lot of ground in the last 25 minutes, so we do have a couple of follow-up questions. The first one is for Jenny. And the question was, this was during the early slides in your presentation, is the protein intake for vegans from complete proteins?
Well, you know, we don't use the term complete proteins so much anymore because essentially all proteins are complete. All plant proteins contain all of the essential amino acids. So we encourage vegans and vegetarians to eat a variety of different plant proteins since they, you know, they tend to, they have different amino acid patterns. Some have higher levels of certain amino acids, which is why we encourage vegans to include legumes in their diet because they're the best sources of lysine. But as long as vegans and vegetarians are eating a variety of foods, including legumes, and meeting their calorie intake, they are going to get adequate protein and adequate amino acids. We don't recommend complementing proteins any longer. You know, you don't have to eat grains plus legumes at every meal. Just eat a wide variety of foods, make sure you're getting enough calories, make sure you eat legumes. Those are basically the 3 rules.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Okay, this next one is for Mark. Is isolated soy protein from bars and powders too potent in some amount? Any harm, and how many bars or powder is okay in a day?
That question is way too hard. Can you go to the next one? So that's an interesting question. First, I would emphasize that, you know, ideally you're going to be getting your soy from whole foods, and that's the recommendation you would make regardless of soy. You always try to go for whole foods. But I do consume products on a regular basis that are made from isolated soy protein because it's such a good source of protein. It's not too potent. The quality of soy protein is really excellent. We actually have more clinical data on isolated soy protein than soy foods because that's what's used in the clinical studies because it's easier to incorporate into the diet, and you can also blind the study participants. There is some suggestion that isolated soy protein may slightly increase insulin-like growth factor, but in order to do that, you have to consume quite large amounts. So I think, I use isolated soy protein myself from different products, but I think you want to emphasize getting soy from whole foods.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about calcium absorption. And I think, Mark, this was when you were talking about calcium absorption. So the question is, how about the absorption of calcium in tofus that are not set with calcium chloride? Does that make a difference?
Again, it's a good question, but no, as I showed for the soy milk research, they used not calcium chloride, but they used tricalcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. There was tricalcium phosphate is absorbed a little bit better than is calcium carbonate. And people that have studied this issue have puzzled as to why the calcium is so well absorbed from soy despite being high in phytate and oxalate, and nobody has really come up with an answer. But even if you look at soybeans, that, you know, not just plain commodity-based soybeans, you see that from work published by Heaney in 1991, you see the absorption is really, really good, much higher than calcium absorption from any of the other beans.
Okay. Thank you. So we've received a number of questions about debunking concerns about soy and cancer. And I know you hit on that, but I think it might be worth circling back to. So for example, this question says, I'm wondering how to debunk concerns about soy and cancer. From my knowledge, it is only estrogen-sensitive breast cancers that require caution with soy intake. Your expertise is appreciated. So can you weigh in on that, Mark?
Yes, thanks. First of all, the entire concern is based on animal studies in mice that began to be published in the late 1990s and were published really over the next 20 years. It was only for another decade or so that human research began to be published that directly refuted these concerns. And when you actually look at the observational data, you see that consuming soy after a diagnosis of breast cancer is actually associated with protective effects against both estrogen receptor positive and estrogen receptor negative breast cancer. In the clinical trials that have looked at markers of breast cancer risk, including breast tissue density and taking biopsies and looking at breast cell proliferation, there's no adverse effects whatsoever, even if you're consuming the equivalent of 10 or 15 servings of soy per day. Now, in contrast to the lack of effect on, say, cell proliferation in response to soy, if you take hormone replacement therapy, you will see an increase in cell proliferation of anywhere from 4 to 10-fold within just a matter of weeks. So really, it's the animal data that is cause for concern. The human data are completely supportive of safety and potential benefit. And that's why all those health organizations concluded that breast cancer patients can safely consume soy. And one more point, if you actually tweak the animal model that gave rise to the controversy, if you tweak it, in my opinion, in a more physiological direction, you actually see that even in that model, soy and isoflavones are not stimulating the growth of mammary tumors.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Let's see here. We'll get a couple more questions here, and then whatever we don't get to on the webinar live today, Mark and Jenny have graciously offered to try to answer those questions offline. So if we don't get to your question, we'll try to follow up with an email. Let's see, next question. Mark, again to you. Can you speak to the concerns that soy is feminizing? I see this argument a lot, particularly on social media, from men in the low-carb, keto, carnivore movement.
Yeah. It better not, because I eat a lot of soy. And again, that myth actually started as a result of a case report describing one individual, a 60-year-old man who consumed 3 quarts, 12 cups of soy milk per day. He was consuming almost an entirely soy diet. And the amount of soy consumed, the amount of isoflavones consumed was about 10 times higher than typical Japanese intake. If you look at the clinical trials, you see no effects even if you're consuming 6 or 7 servings of soy per day. And what's unfortunate is that the reason this myth became so popularized is because of an article published in Men's Health magazine in 2009 which asked whether soy was the most dangerous food for men. About 10 years later, in 2019, they actually acknowledged that their treatment of the issue was extremely hyperbolic. So all of the clinical data shows that soy does not feminize men, regardless of the endpoint that you're studying. And as I mentioned, it's great for building muscle in response to resistance exercise training.
Okay, great. Now this is kind of a build off of that. With the interest in intermittent fasting, does this compromise muscle building if people who follow this would be unable to consume 25 grams protein at 3 times per day?
I will tell you that that question is outside my area of expertise, but it's one I think about a lot, because if you look at the papers from the experts in the field, they talk about the fact that muscle is being broken down and you need on a regular basis throughout the day, and that you need amino acids in place so that muscle can be built back up. And it suggests what I think the question implies is that if you're fasting, like is the case for bed rest, you may end up losing muscle. And that's why some experts have actually recommended consuming a protein right before bedtime to account for the 8 or 9 hours perhaps that you're inactive. But I don't know if that question has been addressed clinically, and I would defer you to someone with more expertise in that area than I have.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question, and this one I think is for Mark too. Is there any research on applications of soy for treatment or prevention of diabetes, either type 1 or type 2?
Yes, there has been some. I think the data are mixed. There's some data suggesting isoflavones have some beneficial effects. Polyunsaturated fat, which you would find in soy foods, tends to increase insulin sensitivity in comparison to saturated fat. There is some evidence, a meta-analysis recently published showing that soy actually helped with glucose control. So I would say the evidence is actually fairly encouraging.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, well, we want to take just another minute to thank all of you who attended today and took time from your busy schedules to learn about the ways soy can provide important information to plant-based, vegetarian, and vegan diets. So if what you heard today was beneficial to you, I would invite you to connect with the Soy Connection on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which are shown on the screen now, or visit our website, soyconnection.com. We regularly share resources, research-based information, recipes, and tips about soy to tout the benefits of this high-quality plant protein. We will be hosting another Soy Connection webinar upon the release of the spring issue of the Soy Connection newsletter. So make sure you look in the next issue of the newsletter for that date and time so you can tune in on that webinar as well. Immediately following the end of this webinar, when the window closes, you'll be invited to take a survey about today's event. And we really would appreciate if you could take just 2 to 3 minutes to complete that survey so we can utilize your feedback to continue to provide you with worthwhile and relevant content. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you all have a great day.